What was your most bone-chilling moment? Story 1. One time I was out in Colorado with some buddies, hiking near the top of a mountain. Some bad weather started to roll in, but the top was only 15 minutes away, so I went ahead while they went back down. As I was getting to the top, I felt static in the air and the hair on my head started to stand up. I immediately started to panic because I thought I was going to get struck by lightning, so naturally I ran down without ever getting to the top. I'm not sure if I was going to get struck, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. Lightning was, in fact, about to strike you. According to the National Weather Service, if this happens to you, you're supposed to drop to your knees and bend forward, but don't lay flat down on the ground. Wet ground is a good conductor of electricity. Story 2. I worked a lot in remote areas of West Texas servicing oil field related equipment. One time I was out in the middle of nowhere, as usual, and to the northeast was a butte, an isolated hill that's bigger than a regular hill but smaller than a mountain. But everywhere else around was pretty flat. There was one road in and out of the site that I was at. At some point when I was working on a control box, I had the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I scanned the horizon, looked all around the butte, and went back to work. This happened a few more times within several minutes until I finally saw something move on the side of one of the rocks. I went to my truck, grabbed my binoculars, and the figure hid behind the rocks. It was a human. I scanned the area with my binoculars for a good 20 minutes and I could see him peek around every couple of minutes. Eventually, he leaned out so far that I could see the silhouette of the barrel of a rifle slung around his back. At some point, he was hidden behind his rock for a while, and the next time he peeked out, I couldn't see the rifle. He had either put it down somewhere or he was now holding it. I immediately felt a sense of impending doom. The hair on my arms and neck were standing straight up. I very quickly collected my tools, got my gun from behind the driver's seat and sat it on the passenger seat, and I tore out of there. I sped down the dirt road, almost clipped the cattle guard, and started cruising down the highway just as the adrenaline started to wear off. I remember the metal taste in my mouth and having to grip the steering wheel to keep my fingers from twitching. A few miles down the road, a maroon Suburban full of guys was pulled over on the oncoming side of the road. They weren't oil field workers. Shades all around, buzzed heads, all intently looking at me. I expected them to pull a U-turn and pursue me, but they didn't. I can't prove that this is what was happening, but I do know that cartel guys run operations where one will scout for guys working alone and call in a group of guys to rob them of their truck and tools. Man, this guy was just trying to do his job and he ended up in a Breaking Bad scene. Story 3. I was walking from a local shopping mall to the train station so I could go home. The shortcut went through a long, huge tunnel and was out of sight from the road and wasn't used unless you knew the area. When I got to the tunnel, I looked up and saw one guy standing right at the end of the tunnel in the middle, just looking in my direction, like he was waiting. Every hair on my body stood on end, and I felt like I needed to vomit. And before I knew what I was doing, my feet turned me around and started walking fast away. He started walking after me and said, "Don't worry, it's not like I'm going to R you." I ran and started walking on the edge of the highway in plain view of cars in case he ran after me. I couldn't stop shaking for an hour. I was walking home from work, along a busy street. He was driving and slowed way down to keep pace with me, said he was a firefighter and that it was about to storm, so I should get in his car. I said no thanks. He kept pushing. Finally, I was about to walk past a hotel, but he pulled partially into the hotel parking lot, enough to block my path. Thankfully, the hotel guard saw me looking uncomfortable. As soon as the hotel guard took a step towards us, the guy peeled out and sped away. This just confirms he was not in fact a firefighter and I would have been in danger if I went with him. Scary. I remember in elementary school having to watch all those stranger danger videos and thinking that no adult would be stupid enough to think kids actually fell for those made-up one-liners. And then I grew up and realized I was painfully wrong. Story 4. When I was about 4 years old, I was playing alone in my front yard in a very rural area. We'd see maybe 5 cars a day. My parents were both inside keeping an eye on me, but from where they were, I looked alone. I remember a grown adult man pulling up in front of our house and rolling down his window to call me over. Even at that age, I knew I wasn't supposed to get close to this guy. I took a few steps forward and he started asking me if I could tell him how to get to a certain place in my town. I was 4, so I was like, huh? So he repeated himself. I was just wondering if you could give me directions. Next thing I know, my dad comes storming out of the front door, visibly very upset, asking what on earth this guy wants. The guy mumbled something about needing directions, then sped away. How interesting. You can ask the 4-year-old for directions, but not the adult who would actually be able to help you. Story 5. A lot of years ago, I was working at the Cincinnati airport as a ramp agent. I was working a department plane by myself, so I was hustling around to get the baggage door closed, signaling the pilot on engine startup procedures, and I still had to unplug the power cart and marshal the plane out. The power cart was parked behind the starboard wing, and cable plugged into a jack on the plane's underside. The pilot signaled me to disengage it, so I acknowledged him and ran from my position to where I needed to be, which is a task in itself. The exhaust from the turboprop engine is several hundred degrees, so you have to duck under the jet blast to reach the jack. I shut off the power cart, reached the jack, unplugged it, latched the door, and then started running back towards the nose to get the plane rolling, always rushing around in a hurry. I'd only run a few steps when my left leg just didn't drop. I felt like my leg was almost moving in slow motion. My foot finally planted, my knee locked, and I felt the impact in my teeth. This interrupted my stride in such a way that it turned me, heading directly away from the plane. That's when I realized my next step would have taken me through the propeller. That is the closest I've ever come to fainting. I have no idea what caused that change in stride, but I am certainly glad of it. Sounds like your muscles unionized due to poor management from the brain. Story 6. Back when I was in college, a friend of mine showed up to hang out a few times with all kinds of bruises on his face, cuts, split lip, etc. He said it was some idiot at a party that he got into a fight with, but it kept happening, so I called him out. Finally, I drug it out of him. He was going to an underground fighting ring, some backyard brawler thing to make some extra money, so I convinced him to take me with him. I wanted to get in on it. I grew up in rough neighborhoods and fought a lot when I was younger, so I figured I could hold my own. So I went a few times. I did pretty well too. Won 3 fights and made a little extra cash. However, the last time we went, as we were leaving, we saw this kid that had lost his fight surrounded by a bunch of guys afterward. He didn't have the money to back himself. We figured he would just get a beat down, so my friends and I picked up the pace. We were halfway through the parking lot when we heard the kid screaming. I'll never forget the sound he made. I have no idea what they did to him, but after hearing that, we never went back. Well, that got dark. Story 7. Back when my son was only about a year old, my husband worked the second shift, so I was alone every evening. We lived in townhouses at the time and had a neighbor who was a war vet. My husband was friendly with him. He was a little off in the sense that there was very obvious PTSD and possibly other trauma, but all around a nice guy. Anyway, one evening, this guy knocked on the door. I opened it thinking he probably was looking for my husband, and I was just gonna let him know that he was working. He was super drunk, wouldn't stop talking, and kinda made his way into the house. He also brought his huge German Shepherd with him. I was trying to be friendly, but I had the worst feeling in my stomach. I felt insanely vulnerable, like something just wasn't right with this situation. I kept trying to tell him in the nicest way to leave, but he wouldn't. So I texted my husband, "Hey, neighbor guy's here and won't leave. He's trashed, and I feel really uncomfortable." My husband texted his buddies that lived a few townhouses down, and they came over immediately. They got the dude out of the house, and not even 20 minutes later, I hear noises outside, and this guy is trying to rip the license plate off of my car. My husband's friends heard it or saw it. I'm not sure, but they went over to him and were more aggressive about him going home and leaving me alone. And he did, or so I thought. A few hours later, my husband gets home and sees this guy hanging out crouched behind some cars. He goes up to him to ask him exactly what he thinks he's doing. I don't know the exact details because I stayed hiding in the house, but this guy had ropes and some other weapon on him and had full intentions of assaulting me that night. It makes me sick to think that if my husband's friends wouldn't have come over as fast as they did to help me, my poor son would have watched something horrible happen to me, or even what he would have even done to my child. Story 8. July 27th, 2002. The Sknyliv Air Show disaster. I turned 5 years old the day before. It was one of my most vivid memories from childhood, how the pilot landed 10 meters away from me and my dad. He was on his knees, his parachute dangling in the wind, and I remember him repeating, "What have I done?" over and over. I didn't understand much of what happened. My dad only said, "Close your eyes, we have to go." My dad told me years after that we would have gone farther into the crowd, but I refused to go because my shoelace was untied. Him kneeling to tie my shoes is the only thing that saved us. It wasn't bone-chilling at the time, but when I imagine what my dad witnessed that day, I get goosebumps. The pilot ended up with a sentence, almost certainly an unfair one in my opinion. Everything about it, from plane maintenance to the maps they were given, was wrong, and he still almost managed to save it. He had even asked for an additional training flight the day before so that he could confirm the terrain, and that was denied, presumably to save money. He was the scapegoat. Story 9. I'm a criminal defense investigator. I had a murder case involving two brothers. The one accused of the murders was very autistic, and his brother was schizophrenic. The schizophrenic brother lived in a shack in the middle of the desert. I needed to talk to him several times throughout the investigation, and since he didn't have a phone or electricity, I had to drive several hours out to his house and yell his name from the fence line until he came out of the shack. This investigation lasted for several years, and over time I developed a rapport with the schizophrenic brother, and I kind of got to like him. He would talk your ear off about the aliens with golden eyes and the underground tunnels that connect all the Walmarts in the country. But he was pretty entertaining, and part of me wonders how much of it was a show. The schizophrenic brother eventually gets a girlfriend. She's a tweaker who has mistaken his schizophrenia for meth-induced psychosis. I talked to her a few times in jail when she was sober, and she was surprisingly charming and insightful. The last time I went to see the schizophrenic brother, it was a dark winter night, and his girlfriend was there. She was lurking in the shadows and staring daggers at me the entire time I was talking to him. I cut off our conversation and started to walk back to my truck. A minute later, he comes running out and tells me that he wants to show me something in his shack. He's never invited me inside before, and I'm not thrilled by the prospect. The whole thing feels off to me, so I tell him I have to get going and start the truck. The look of relief on his face when I declined to go inside convinced me that his tweaker girlfriend was waiting behind the door with a hammer or something. A few months later, I learned that she shot him in his sleep and stashed his body in an old refrigerator. She has since pleaded guilty to his murder. Story 10. Hiking in the Rocky Mountains, on a trail I knew pretty well. I was leading a group of kids, maybe 20 or so middle school-aged children from the camp where I worked. I turned a corner and saw the jawbone of a deer. Pretty cool, showed it to the kids. It didn't have any flesh on it, so I assumed it was pretty old. 100 feet further down the trail, I find another bone. A femur, maybe. I specialized in insect populations, not deer anatomy. This one looked a little fresher. A little further down, another bone. I'm getting a little nervous at this point, so I explained that we should probably turn around and head back. My students all groan that they want to see more dead stuff, but I shepherd them down the trail and back to the camp. 2 days later, we get a call at the camp that someone had been attacked in the area by a mountain lion. Apparently, a mountain lion had set itself up in the caves on the cliffside and had gotten mad when someone got too close. Obviously, I'm glad we left the area, even if my students would have loved to see more dead stuff. Please like and subscribe if you've made it this far. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the video and have a wonderful day. Story 11. I used to drive an ambulance, and the company that I worked for had more ambulances than there were firehouses and medic stations to keep up with increasing call volumes. So we would do something called posting, where you park the ambulance somewhere within the area that you're servicing while waiting for a call. I was working the midnight to 10 a.m. shift one night, and it was really slow. On slow nights, we would go to the darkest areas we could find to post in an attempt to catch some sleep. We found a church within a neighborhood whose parking lot had virtually no light, so we decided to park there. As soon as my partner put the rig in park, I instantly felt extremely uncomfortable and unsafe. I didn't want to say anything to my partner because we had no reason to feel this way, but the feeling was almost overwhelming. A few minutes go by and my partner looks at me and says, "Hey man, I don't feel right. Something just feels off. Do you want to get out of here?" I said yes so fast and we got out of there. I have never really figured out why we both had that sensation and why it came on in that church's parking lot, but it sure did give us the creeps. Always listen to your gut, even if you can't completely back up your reasons logically. Recently, my family was traveling all over Costa Rica. We love nature, but we fear and respect it. We knew there were crocodiles on the west side and we talked to the locals about the dangers when we traveled. Often the biggest issue was snakes. So we went to the East Caribbean side. We set up shop on the beach near a ravine, and I kept looking at this ravine. I knew crocodiles can look like logs and that they're still until they attack. I kept staring and couldn't see anything, so I tried to calm myself down. We had a toddler and I told her to stay away, then I told my husband something felt weird. We were hyper aware. I just couldn't calm myself, so I pulled up my phone to look up if there are even crocs in this area. The internet says one hasn't been spotted for nearly 10 years. I went on my Facebook groups and everyone said no, not in this area. It only happens in extreme drought. Still, I couldn't calm down, so I told my family I'm sorry I didn't want to ruin a beach day, but we couldn't stay. We left and just decided to do a different activity. 2 days later, we were at a restaurant and it was all over the news that a little kid about 8 years old got attacked by a crocodile at that beach. I almost vomited watching that. I can't tell you if it was the same spot since it's a good-sized beach, but I don't care. It could have been my family. I'm not an easily frightened person, so when my intuition perks up, I have to tell myself to listen and don't try to rationalize it away. My husband trusted me and didn't complain or invalidate me, which makes me so happy. Story 12. When I was 16 or 17, I was texting with a friend's older brother, 19 or 20, who was a local paramedic. He was so sweet to me. Love bombing sweet. At that age, I didn't know better and just loved the idea that an older guy was so sweet to me. I'd only ever met him in person once at a ball game. One day, he randomly showed up at the little countryside cafe I worked at. He insisted I take his Letterman jacket, even though it was in the heat of summer. It was weird, but he was insistent, so I took it. We kept texting and things got weird and possessive. I got scared and ghosted him. I never told him where I lived. But not even a few days later, I was home alone, way out in the middle of nowhere with my younger stepsister, and I heard banging on the door. It was him. He was yelling for me to come out right away, beating on the door. It was an old, run-down, single-wide trailer, so nothing was really home invasion-proofed. He started kicking the door hard. The whole trailer was practically shaking. He threw stuff at the windows while screaming. I got my mom's shotgun, hid my stepsister in the closet, and called the police. It felt like forever. He didn't stop until I heard tires pull up on the gravel. A cop came inside and told me the crazy guy claimed that I stole his Letterman jacket and class ring, and he was just there to get his stuff back. The ring was in the jacket pocket, but I didn't know until that moment, so I gave it to the cop. I don't know what happened to the guy, but needless to say, there was no future contact. I still don't know how he learned where I lived. Story 13. My wife and I were on a search mission for some missing fern pickers. We were volunteers with the local search and rescue team. We decided to stay in the search area that night and built a pretty nice fire. We were sitting there and it was about 2 a.m., hoping this dude would wander into camp. I had heard animals around us throughout the night. No surprise, we're in the middle of the woods. I'm used to animals stalking around outside my camp. I knew there were 2 animals, one on each side of us. It was at about that point when we heard a bird chirp. It came from about the place I figured one of the animals was, then another from the opposite side. I immediately realized we were being watched and stalked by at least 2 cougars. We very quickly climbed into the back of my truck. It's got a camper shell and is outfitted for truck camping. Cougars chirp like birds to communicate. There are a bunch of videos of it on YouTube, but it's super creepy when they're stalking your camp at 2 in the morning. There was another time my son was throwing rocks into a bush off a Forest Service road. He was throwing small pebbles big enough to hear them, not big enough to cause falling dirt. He threw one and we heard a bunch of dirt and gravel suddenly slide down the hill. I jumped across the road and grabbed my son and started throwing fist-sized rocks into the bush. My wife and son took off walking calmly down the road. She looked back in time to see me peg a cougar in the side and it bolted. The day before, they had a cougar drag off an 11-year-old kid who managed to escape in the same area. We didn't find out about that until we called our local wildlife department about what we just saw. That cat 100% wanted my kid. I don't blame it, honestly. He was easy prey at 3. Story 14. I used to be a Jehovah's Witness as a kid. That thing where they go around knocking on doors to preach to you? I was doing that with my mom and a few others. We walked up this slanted driveway with trees around each side. They couldn't see my mom and me from the street in the car. We knocked on the door. Everything seemed normal. The man answered the door, still seeming normal, except for this time I got hit by something I couldn't see. My ears started ringing and buzzing like crazy. It felt like a helmet had been put on, and my body was screaming at me to leave. The man listened to my mom's intro, then said he was interested in hearing more and invited us in. All those things got so much stronger. The air felt like it got so dense, it was keeping me from moving. My mom looked at me and she said I looked off, pale and distant. She told him that I seemed to be ill and that we should just leave. As soon as we stepped onto the ground in view of the car, I was completely fine. A few days later, we read in the paper about how that man was arrested for the assault and murder of a few women. I think one of them was just a 16-year-old kid. I was 12 at the time. My mom, the dutiful witness she was at the time, was convinced that the angels stepped in to protect us, like we had heard stories about before. She said Jehovah used them to make me feel off to keep us safe. Story 15. In the summer of 2019, I was house-sitting for my dad while he was away for work. The house is in the middle of nowhere and barely even on Google Maps. Usually, when friends would come over, I would have to drive to the top of the nearest paved road and lead them down a few unpaved streets to my dad's place. I had a few drinks with friends and was dropped off by a friend that lived close by. He dropped me at the side of the house because it was easier for him to turn the car around there. So I walked up the stairs and entered with my key through the side door that led to the kitchen. The kitchen overlooked the front garden, but the front door was nestled into a small porch and wasn't visible to me. I saw a movement in the front garden while I was making tea in the kitchen and immediately turned off the lights. A man was trying to look into the kitchen windows from the garden. He ended up walking around to the wall-to-ceiling glass doors around the back of the house, cupping his hands to the glass and trying to look in. I wasn't completely sober that night, so I remember just thinking the situation didn't seem real. He couldn't see me in the dark, but I was hiding behind the wall that separated the kitchen from the lounge area. I had stupidly not locked one of the glass doors closer to the front door, so he started entering the house. In the pitch black, not realizing I was maybe 10 feet away from him, I had already called the friend who had dropped me off, since I knew he was still nearby. Cops would have taken at least 30 minutes to get to me. Plus, I knew his parents kept a gun safe in the truck. I remember just wanting to run and get out of the house ASAP. The situation didn't feel real at all, like something from a movie. I was acting on adrenaline, but if I ran, I'd be alone in the middle of nowhere with a deranged man chasing after me. As the guy walked further into the house, I stepped out and pulled a knife on him. Again, I was not sober. It was a very stupid thing to do. He tried incoherently to make a conversation, but I got him out of the door just as my friend pulled up with his gun. The guy bolted to his car, which was parked in an area concealed by trees on the property. Turns out, he was the gardener. He had been keeping tabs on me, knew I was house-sitting alone for my dad while he was out of town, was very high on meth. He admitted this to me while I had the knife out, and had been waiting on the front porch for me to come home, except I had used the side door that night, something I never usually did. If I hadn't used the side door that night, I have no idea what would have happened. I also have no idea what would have happened if my friend hadn't come back when I called him, because the guy was starting to get aggressive and trying to come towards me right when my friend got there with his gun out. We kind of joke about it now, but it was the worst scenario in which I've ever felt the need to run for my life. Story 16. I must have been around 10 to 12 when this happened. I was walking back home one afternoon after strolling around the neighborhood, which was usually very safe, friendly, and quiet. I was on the opposite side of the block, the houses behind ours, which wasn't an issue because there happened to be a park that went across the block and connected to the other side, so I didn't have to go around the whole block, and I was only a few houses away. I went through the park, a park I had played in my entire childhood, without paying much attention, when about halfway through, this guy who I didn't know, definitely older than me, wearing a hoodie, started calling me. He said, "Dude, come here for a second." I replied, what do you want?" "Come here, I just want to ask you something." "Okay, ask me from over there." No, just come here real quick." I wasn't dumb, so I again said, "No, tell me from over there." At that point, another dude that was sitting next to him got upset. I heard him say, "That's it," and they both stood up quickly and started making their way towards me. I can't recall how far they chased me, but my instincts just told me to run like my life depended on it, so I did. To this day, I still don't know if they were gonna mug me, or if they thought it was funny, or what was happening, but it terrified kid me. Story 17. I was installing a camera in a customer's home with another guy at work. The wife of the couple we were installing for began the appointment by ranting. I remember part of her rant was like, "All the cops are murderers, all of them, and they didn't do a thing to protect the White House, yet they arrest me and throw me in jail for quoting scripture while I'm in court. It's just like my landlord and the cops are trying to screw me, just like the White House was." I was dumbfounded and accidentally ended up letting her go on for 5 minutes before I cut her off. It was her husband though. The way he looked at both my coworker and me was like a person staring through me, like he knew he was looking at me but didn't see me. In his garage, where we were mounting the camera, this guy with dead eyes closed the garage door, looked at me for a long stretch of 5 seconds, then said, "Yep, over there is where we let them suffer before we gotta cut the heads off. Gotta let them suffer before cutting the heads off." He locked the outside garage door, turned around, and then just started murmuring about cutting off heads again. He must have brought up murder 5 to 8 times in a 10-minute stretch. He told me his name was Sergeant something or other. I don't remember now, but I told him thank you for your service. He looked at me with those dead eyes. I was never in the military. A long stretch of silence. His wife called him on his Apple Watch and asked, "Everything okay down there? Anybody up to something?" Another long stretch of silence before he replies, "Everything's fine. We're just in the garage. Everybody's in here, and we're fine. I'll call you if I need you." It was like they were talking about something they didn't want us to hear. My coworker and I kept our scissors and razors in our hands from about 5 minutes into that service call up until we left, neither of us letting him be behind us where we couldn't see him. We were bracing for him to try and get us. After we mounted the camera, he asked us to go through the house back to the panel to learn it. There was was no way I was doing that, so I said we need to take the ladder back out to the truck. He said we could take it through the house. Remember, he had closed and locked the outside garage door earlier. I said it was a safety hazard and needed to go out the big garage door. Once more, he asked us to go through the house, to which I replied that we couldn't do that because of company policy with the outdoor ladder. He stared at me for roughly 5 to 10 seconds of silence this time, then went and opened the garage door. Both of us split out of there and didn't look back. We told the company and they locked the account. We wondered if we should have called the cops. I have no idea what would have happened to my coworker if he showed up there alone. He was scheduled to be alone. I randomly picked that day to audit him. My coworker swears it felt like the guy was looking at something less than human and worthy of killing when he looked at us. Creepiest thing I've ever been around. Story 18. I met a guy at a bar who was sitting alone, as was I, and I was buzzed enough to start talking to him about a tattoo of his that caught my eye. We talked and he seemed super chill. We had some common interests. He was about my age. We were both getting very playfully flirty with each other. We decided to make out in his car, so we left the bar. I was vibing with him. We were going to make out for a bit, exchange numbers, and go our separate ways. It was probably around 1 a.m. anyway. The second we got in his car, he was like a different person. I don't want to go into a ton of detail, but he didn't like that I was willing to make out with him, but not anything more. I had also just worked an 8-hour shift before going to that bar after work and felt gross. He tried immediately pushing my boundaries in forceful, aggressive, and threatening ways. I lied about leaving something in the bar and had to lie about how I couldn't wait to come back and do things with him. I noped out of there, called an Uber, and he blew up my phone with texts and calls for hours until I finally blocked his number. I can distinctly remember the fight or flight instinct the moment he started getting aggressive. One of the strongest fears of my life just kicked in and had to dip. Even though I was drunk, I remember clearly his personality when at the bar, gaining my trust in public, versus once we were alone in his car. I've never met someone that changed suddenly. All at once, it was terrifying. Thanks for watching until the end. Please leave your story in the comments below. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. For more videos like this one right now, please stop by our channel. Thanks again, and see you next time.